Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the Richard W. and Patricia R. Pogue Endowed Forum, where today we have the great fortune of having Speaker John Boehner here to address us. My name is Fred Nance. I'm the Global Managing Partner of Squire Patton Boggs US LLP, and I'm going to share with you that, of course, I had prepared extensive biographical information, which obviously the speaker more than warrants. But as I was sitting here, he looks at me and says, "Fred, don't do that." So I'm going to give you the much abridged version. There is bioinformation on the pamphlet that is on everyone's table. Let me simply jump forward and say that when John Boehner became the top Republican leader in the House for nearly a decade, he eventually became the Speaker at a time that was obviously very challenging, very difficult for our country, and his laser-like focus on economic development, removing the impediments between business and government for the creation of jobs, and focusing on the reduction of our debt were things that were priorities, obviously, for our country, but it was his interpersonal skill set, his ability to reach across the aisle, to try to bridge the divisions both within the party as well as across the aisle, that led to the success and the leadership that we are very grateful to have had and are looking for going forward. I would like you to know that he has a special place in our firm. He joined us as a special advisor based upon his extensive experience. We're very happy to have him. Indeed, the firm has been privileged to have him. The City Club is privileged to have him, and I dare say America has been very privileged to have John Boehner as our leader, as the third most powerful person in our government for years. And today he's going to share his comments on the future of our political system, in case there happen to be any questions about that these days. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the retired Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, John Boehner.
Well, where do I begin? Big thanks, Fred, for your short introduction. I think you did a very nice job without getting too carried away. Let me thank the City Club for the opportunity to be with all of you today. I especially want to thank the Pogues. Dick has been a longtime friend and supporter, and I didn't know this was your luncheon that you were hosting, but thank you for having me here. You know, I was here 6 years ago. Right before I became Speaker, I came and, at your invitation, do an economic speech where I called on the President to fire his economic team. They didn't like that. They savaged me afterwards. But I think I was right. But here it is 6 years later, no longer the Speaker of the House after spending some 25 years in the Congress. And as I told the students at Notre Dame gave Vice President Biden and I the Laetare Award. And so I told these students, I said, you know, Laetare is a Latin word. In English, it means rejoice. Exactly what I've done every day since I left. You know, people stop me and think I'm going to go back into the government. I had cab driver the other day wanted to know if I was running for the Senate next year. I was like, whoa, no, no. Well, I'm supposed to talk about the future of politics, and I thought about this, and I thought, well, wait a minute. I'm no expert on politics. I've never even taken a political science class. On top of that, I'm the son of a bartender. What the hell do I know about politics? But for those of you who don't know much about me, I grew up in Cincinnati. I have 8 brothers and 3 sisters, and my dad owned a bar. And, I tell people there's a lot of lessons I learned growing up that were lessons that really helped me do my job. You know, you grew up in a big family, you have to learn to get along with each other, get things done together, get things done as a family. You grew up in a bar, learned a couple lessons there. One, I learned the art of being able to disagree without being disagreeable. Something that probably helped me more in my political career than anything else. Because, in a bar, you can't, if you're the bartender, you can disagree with somebody, but you don't have to put up with them all night long. And so you want to be nice about it. But I think the best lesson I ever learned growing up in a bar where I mopped floors, did dishes, waited tables, tended bar, is you have to learn to deal with every jackass that walks in the door. Trust me, I needed all the skills I learned growing up to do my job. But I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd ever get involved in politics. Like a lot of you, I worked my way through school, went to Muller High School along with my 8 brothers, played football for Jerry Faust. Sorry, Fred. Ignatius boy. But worked my way through Xavier University, found myself in a small business that I bought, and grew it into a successful business. And along the way, I got involved in my neighborhood homeowners association and ended up as Speaker of the House. This too could happen to you. Honestly, I had never in my wildest dreams I ever thought I would do anything like this. But I was kind of made to do what I ended up doing throughout my career, and I'm very happy about it. Well, what a political year we have had. Well, no, I knew there was something I forgot. I want to congratulate Cleveland on the biggest year you've had in a long time. I thought Cleveland had a great year when Johnny Manziel signed up, and when LeBron James was coming home, and there was this announcement that the RNC was coming to Cleveland. That was a big year. But winning the NBA championship, and then going to the World Series, and then hosting the finest Republican convention I have ever attended. I tell you what, everybody I talked to around the country after the convention who had been here could not have said nicer things about Cleveland. How nice it was, how nice everybody was, how safe it was, and none of that nonsense that people talked about, none of it ever really happened. And so congratulations on a really good year. And I'm sure Donald Trump's going to be pretty happy that he had a pretty good year as well. Listen, now, something's going on around the world. It's not just here in the United States where a guy named Bernie Sanders, a man who was elected for the first time when I was elected for the first time in 1990. He was a socialist from Vermont and came to Washington, old liberal curmudgeon guy walking around. Trust me, the most shocked people in America are all of us who served with Bernie over the last 25 years. Because Bernie didn't talk to anybody. He's just walking around. Now, he might have been the most honest guy, though, running for president. Because he actually believes all that crazy stuff that he says. But you couldn't help but love Bernie. And then Donald Trump, really? He was a friend of mine. We played a lot of golf together over the years. But, I never really thought that Donald Trump was the kind of guy that ought to be president of the United States. Matter of fact, in a conversation I had with him in the spring, he says, "Hey, can you believe this?" I said, "No." He said, "No, I can't either." But it's not just here in the United States. You watch the Brexit vote that went on earlier this year over in Great Britain. You watch what's going on over in France, what's going on in Germany. Look back to the Arab Spring. There's something going on in the world. And I kind of would boil it down into 2 big points with a sub point. First is you look around, we've had 8 years of very slow to no economic growth. And as a result, the middle class and their standard of living really has kind of fallen, not just here, but elsewhere around the world. And so you've got a lot of frustration that Americans aren't doing as well as they'd like to be doing. The kind of job migration that we used to see in our society has kind of disappeared. And after 8 years of your income sliding, your standard of living sliding, you can imagine that people are frustrated. And it's not just here. I think it's elsewhere around the world as well. Secondly, look at how the media has changed, how we get information. I'll just go back a couple of decades. A couple of decades ago, we had one radio talk show host in America that no one ever heard of. We had one cable news channel that just did news. We had an internet, but only a couple of geeks in Palo Alto, California were using it. And you look at where we are today with hundreds and hundreds of radio talk show hosts spewing out all kinds of noise. Look at all these cable news channels. What do? They do nothing but politics 24 hours a day. You've got an internet that allows people to talk to each other, to organize themselves, platforms that people never had before. And then you've got Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn. I can get down the whole long list of other places that spew information just in tons. And if you think about it, I mean, we would never have known about a policeman being shot in Dallas, Texas, 30 years ago, because it wouldn't have been in our papers. It probably wouldn't have been on the national news. And so now we know everything that happens in America. We know everything that happens all around the world every day. And when you look at all this information that's coming at all of us, you realize that people are probably getting 100, maybe 200 times more information about their government than they have ever gotten, certainly more than 20 years ago. What makes it even crazier is that people get to choose where they want to get their news. You know, it used to be we had 3 big TV networks, we had 5 big newspapers, and a couple of big radio stations, and they pretty well set what the news was going to be for that day. Now you've got all this information coming at you, and so people get to choose. You know, some want to go to BuzzFeed, some want to go to Fox News. I asked some, early 30-year-old this fall, I said, where do you get your news? And he says, Comedy Central. Now, that ought to scare people. And so we've got all this information. And what I said before, it allows people to organize themselves. You know, I had a few knuckleheads that I had to work with in Washington. They were on the Republican side. But we always had a few members who were kind of always off the reservation. But they never had any platform. The media kind of ignored them. But today, they can create their own platform and grow their own movement. Frankly, much like Donald Trump created his own movement, or Bernie Sanders created his own movement. But what makes it even more dangerous, more difficult, is that the speed at which people get news today, it's instantaneous. I remember a time when I was serving in the state legislature with Pat Sweeney sitting over there. Thank you. Thankfully, you don't look any uglier than you did then. That's just me being me, sorry. But back then, Sweeney and I, we could work something out, cut some deal, and, it would be a day or two before, it would end up in the press somewhere. Not these days. I remember when I'd have to go meet with the President Obama, and I'd have to organize a way to sneak into the White House. Because if I walked in the White House like I would normally do, the right-wing press would just go crazy. Oh, what's he up to? He's going to sell us out. You can imagine. And frankly, the left-wing press would go after President Obama. Oh, my God, he's meeting with Boehner. Oh, my gosh, Boehner's going to roll him. And all of a sudden, you got no room to maneuver. And so when you add all of this together, you can kind of begin to understand that we are in the midst of a political revolution. And in the midst of a political revolution, trying to govern is next to impossible. And it's going to make it more difficult, I think, in the coming days and the coming years for people in public service to actually be able to govern and do what we really expect them to do. Well, we had a big election this year as well. And, back in the spring, I would talk about, the candidates who were running on both sides. And it was pretty clear to me that Hillary was going to be the Democrat nominee. I wasn't, I told Donald Trump after I said I'd vote for him, I said, you weren't my first choice. Matter of fact, you weren't my second choice or my third choice. But you're going to be the nominee, and I'm going to vote for you. But I told people back in the spring, listen, anybody doesn't think that Donald Trump can't win, you're wrong. I mean, he can win. People would ask me, well, could Donald Trump win Ohio? And I said, of course Donald Trump can win Ohio. As a matter of fact, I'll predict that Donald Trump will win Ohio. When you look at where the demographics in Ohio are, the top third of the state, Toledo, Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, are largely the largest Democratic area in the state. And when you look at the people that Donald Trump was appealing to, they live right here in the top one-third of Ohio. And what Trump was able to do was to get their votes, frankly, early on. All those retired auto workers, all the rest of the union guys and gals that are up here. But where he actually won the election was in the fall, in October, when Republicans started to actually come home. But over the fall, I did a lot of public speeches, made it clear that I thought Hillary was going to win. I thought the 60-40 chance that she would win. I said, but remember this. Polls don't decide elections, voters do. And while pollsters, they think they can model who's going to show up, it's just their best guess who's going to show up. I used an example that I've used many times, that polls don't decide elections, voters do. My first race for Congress, I was in a race with an incumbent Republican in a primary and a former Republican member in a Republican primary. And, it's hard for people to vote for somebody when they can't say your name. My name looks like Boehner. And I'm in this race against the incumbent who's in trouble. He's not going to win. But this former member, his name's Tom Kindness. Kindness. I never had a poll show me within 80 points of winning. Honestly, and my opponent's looking at the same polling numbers, that he's going to waltz in and win this election. And but we turned out people who would not normally vote in the Republican primary. I had 500 volunteers that each got 10 of their neighbors, who happened to be independents, out to vote for me in a Republican primary. I won by 5,000 votes. Nobody's more surprised than, I thought I was going to win, but I'm the eternal optimist. But my poor opponent, he must have been sitting there totally shocked because there was no way he could lose when you're up 82 points. But when you look at this election, once again, I told audiences this fall, look at the enthusiasm gap. How enthused are you about your candidate? Trump led the whole fall. You go back to the spring, the turnout in the Republican primaries was up 40%. Turnout in the Democrat primaries was down 20%. And so really shouldn't surprise a lot of people that he actually did have a chance. Well, he won. Now what? Something's happened in Washington over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, where it was almost impossible for me to do a deal. And when I talk about doing a deal, I mean coming to an agreement with the president on doing what we both think is in the right interest of the American people. And, people would just have their pitchforks out for me and for the president because we were able to come to an agreement once in a while. And I guess I got to tell you, I just think it's wrong. And now we've got a guy who actually wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. And if Donald Trump is going to do anything, he's going to have to deliver. Now, people would ask me, well, what advice would you give each of these candidates depending upon who wins? I said I would give each of these two candidates the same advice. and that is presidents don't have much power to do things on their own. And if you really want to get big things done, you've got to find a way to work with the other side. You need to find a way to work with Congress to change the laws to make real changes. And to do that, you've got to have honest relationships with both sides of the aisle and the leaders in the Congress. And if you do that, there's a lot of, frankly, big things that can happen. I always thought it was very important when I became the Speaker that I had good relationships with my colleagues, my other leaders, and frankly, for that matter, the President. Now, you know, the President and I butted heads a few times, but the President and I learned to get along with each other, learned to get things done together. Not that we always agreed, because our job wasn't to agree. Our job was, what can we agree on? I didn't expect him to change his principles, and I don't think he expected me to change my principles or to compromise my principles or his. But the American people elected him president. They elected a Republican Congress, and our job on behalf of the country was to find the common ground. Where is it? And so finding a way to cut a deal is critically important if we're going to be successful in America. And I frankly think Donald Trump has the ability to do that. You know, he's kind of a Democrat. He's kind of a Republican. He has no ideology, so he's got nothing that's going to bind him, all right, from cutting a deal. But, you know, he's got to cut the right deals. And so when you look at the Congress, you know, the Congress is a committee of 535 people. Anybody ever seen a committee of 535 people accomplish anything? Except the American people expect great things out of their Congress. And this is why the leaders have to be able to look each other in the eye, trust each other in order to get things done. You know, when I announced that I was going to retire, I got more than a few phone calls, but first phone call came from one of my dear friends, George W. Bush. I can't tell you what he said, but nor what I said to him. But the second call comes from President Obama. Boehner, you can't do this. We got to get this done. We got to get a debt deal. We've got to do something about the debt limit. We need a budget. He's going on and on and on. Finally, the president says, "Hey, Boehner, man, I'm going to miss you." And I said, "Mr. President, yes, you are." You know, we knew each other. We understood each other. And we could talk to each other. And it's, you know, yeah, we had lots of disagreements. But remember what I told you earlier, one of those lessons I learned growing up in a bar, the art of being able to disagree without being disagreeable. You know, there are a lot of people I used to have to work with. Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell. I could wait till I write my book. You get to read about a lot of these people. But, you know, over the years I spent in Washington, I'll just say this, 95%, 98% of the people I've worked with on both sides of the aisle are the most decent, honest people you could ever find, fighting for what they thought was right for their constituents or for the country. And just because, you know, you're a Democrat or Republican doesn't mean that the other side should excoriate you because of your views. You know, I've got a right to my view, and you've got a right to your view. So I think the president has an opportunity here. If he'll reach out and work with the Congress, there are big things that can get done. You know, I think tax reform is going to be hot on the Congress's agenda. I think immigration reform is not going to go away, and it has to be dealt with. I think infrastructure is probably one of the first things that will happen. We have huge infrastructure needs in the United States, but we have no way to pay for it. And, you know, all of our infrastructure is paid for with the gas tax. But all of our cars are getting more miles to the gallon. The gas tax revenues continue to drop year after year after year. They're going to continue to drop. And we need to find a new source of funding to do our infrastructure. But in the meantime, dealing with the fact there are $2.5 trillion worth of U.S. corporate profits sitting overseas that won't come back here because we've got these excessively high corporate tax rates, I can see a deal being cut where that money will flow back here at a lower rate. We'll fix the system so we don't have to deal with it long term. And then they'll find an economic and analysis that will determine this will produce $100 or $500 billion in new revenues, and then use that money to fund a longer-term infrastructure program. It'd be a great way to get started. I think it'd be great bipartisan support for a plan like this. And but Donald Trump sees himself as larger than life, as you might imagine. It kind of reminds me of looking at Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt, this guy was a lot like Donald Trump, larger than life. When Teddy Roosevelt became president, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to do big things. And frankly, he did big things. And I think there's an opportunity in this new political order to do big things. But big things only get done on a bipartisan basis. I went round and round with the president over this in 2011 when I became Speaker. If you go back, look historically, big things get done when both parties have their fingerprints on the deal. And so I think he's got that opportunity. Listen, it's going to be an exciting year. If you thought this past year was exciting, just watch what happens over the next 12 months. But just remember this. We live in the greatest country in the world, a country that there's no limits on what you can accomplish, and the only country in the world where you can be the son of a bartender and grow up and be the Speaker of the House. God bless you for all being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we are enjoying a Friday forum with John Boehner, the 53rd Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. We're about to begin the Q&A session with the audience. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via a radio broadcast, webcast, or our new live simulcast at the Parma Snow branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Our staff. We want to remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point and not statements, please. Holding the microphones today are Content Coordinator Terry Eisenberg and Director of Program Stephanie Jansky. May we have the first question, please?
Speaker Boehner, I'd like to ask you about a question that was very prominent in the campaign, and that's the issue of trade. Here in Ohio, of course, we've had people who have suffered because of the trade arrangements, but we've also had many people and companies that have prospered. How do you see that issue working out this year?
Well, it's very difficult to renegotiate a trade agreement. Presidents talk about it, but it's very difficult to do. And in the case of NAFTA, though, NAFTA is now 20-plus years old. It's probably time for all the countries involved in NAFTA to take another look at it. Now, personally, I'm on the other side of this issue. Trade has been great for America. Frankly, trade has been very good for Ohio. Yes, there are job dislocations when you have trade. But when you look at it on the whole, in my view, it's been very beneficial to the United States, and I would argue very beneficial to Ohio. But it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be reviewed from time to time. And the second point I'd make is this, is that enforcement of these trade laws is critically important. And I'm not sure that we've used the resources that we have to enforce the trade laws that we've already agreed to. I do think the Trans-Pacific Partnership is overdone, dead. It was overdone dead a year ago, in my view. Because there were 4 or 5 provisions decided at the end of the negotiation that could never pass muster in the Congress. And there probably aren't 10 votes in the Congress for the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. I think this U.S.-European conversation is pretty much at a standstill. But I do think there is one opening on the trade front, and that is a U.S.-Great Britain trade agreement. While they're exiting the European Union, they're not part of an EU trade agreement. And so they're going to have to make their own trade agreements. And I think as our closest ally, as our closest friends, I think discussion between U.S. and Britain on a free trade agreement would be in both of our countries' best interest, and frankly, be very helpful to the Brits as they negotiate their exit from the European Union.
Mr. Speaker, great to have you here today. I address the issue of a $19.6 trillion debt and climbing. What if the new president and his new Secretary of Treasury and the Senate leaders Schumer and McConnell and Speaker Ryan and Mr. Pelosi called you together and said to you, what would be your recommendations as to how we finally and effectively address this debt before it gets worse?
Well, we have spent more than what we've brought in as a country for 60 of the last 65 years. Let me say this again in case you thought I said this wrong. We've spent more than what we brought in for 60 of the last 65 years. You can't do this in your home, you can't do it in your business, and your government can't do it either. And, the President and I were on the verge of the grand bargain in July of 2011. We stood in the Oval Office, the President and I and Eric Cantor shook hands on a debt reduction deal that was over $5 trillion the first 10 years. Over 25 years, it might have been in the $20 to $25 trillion range in terms of the tails that would have existed because of the changes that we were talking about. And frankly, my greatest disappointment in my years in politics when that deal fell apart. But you've got big drivers of the debt. Baby boomers are retiring at record rates. They're living longer than anybody ever expected we would live, taking up more Social Security, more Medicare, more Medicaid. And those programs are not sustainable in their current form. And we're not talking about massive changes. We're talking about tweaks to put these programs that are essentially important to the American people, critically important, but to put them on a more sound foundation. Until that happens, frankly, there's no chance that you're going to reverse the deficit spending that we continue to do. Secondly, you're never going to solve this problem without real economic growth that allows the economy to grow, that allows better jobs to be created, allowing the American people to earn more, and frankly, as they earn more, to pay more in taxes. If you don't have real economic growth that's growing the economy and some controls on spending, you just can't get there. We were there in the late 90s. We had a balanced budget deal with President Clinton. And what happened? We had 5 years of a surplus. 5 straight years. Surplus was about $600 billion over those 5 years. What happened? Spending only grew at about the rate of inflation. Revenue was growing at 4 or 5% above the rate of inflation. So you got more income coming in, holding the line on spending, and the result was we had a surplus. You can do it, but it's going to be tough to do. Members don't want to vote to make changes to Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. They just don't want to do it. And even some of the most conservative members who want to talk about balancing the budget, if they actually had to vote on the specifics, they'd be shriveling, like a flower on a sun-parched sidewalk somewhere in August. So don't hold your breath.
Mr. Speaker, in a remarkable act of diplomacy, the Pope accepted your invitation to address the joint session of Congress. But then not too long thereafter, there was also a rememberable situation where the then campaign nominee, Trump, took on the Pope in a back-and-forth conversation that maybe wondered, does he need to repair a relationship there, and if so, how?
No, I think Pope Francis will forgive him. I have to tell you, you might have guessed I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, Catholic university. I was an altar boy when I was growing up. And I get to Congress, and we've got some world leaders to come and address a joint session of Congress, the House and Senate. And so 1995, when we had a new pope, I sent him a letter and asked him if he would come and address a joint session of Congress. I was a junior member of the Republican leadership. We were brand new majority. And, of course, I heard nothing. So, the next pope comes along and invite him to come. That didn't happen. And so when Pope Francis got elevated, I sent him a letter. And luckily for me, one of his close allies in the U.S. is Cardinal Wuerl, the Archbishop of Washington. And so Cardinal Wuerl was trying to convince him to come to the U.S., and Pope says, no, I'm going here, here, and here. He said, but I got this letter from your parliament. And he said, I'm somewhat intrigued by this. And so, Cardinal Wuerl said, your Holy Father, that letter was written by John Boehner. He's the Speaker of the House, and he's real involved in helping kids in D.C. get an education. And I've got a number of programs I'm involved in D.C. helping kids of all stripes get an education. And so the Pope looks at Cardinal Wuerl and says, all right, I'll come. So Wuerl runs out of the room, calls me and says, Boehner, you can't tell anybody, but he's coming. Well, so he was coming on September 24th a year ago, and turns out, about the same time this meeting happened, my daughter tells me she's pregnant with my first grandchild. So Cardinal Wuerl and others begin to work the Vatican over to get the Pope to baptize my grandson when he's here. And so you might guess, you might not know this or think about it, but the Vatican has a 2,000-year head start on bureaucracy over the United States. They are really good at this. So after months of conversation, they finally come to me and say, listen, the Pope will be happy to bless your grandson, but we really don't want him to do a baptism. All right, fine. So we get to September 24th, 2015, and the Pope comes, and it's a big deal. I got every camera in the world in my office, and I greet the Pope, and finally get all the media out of the room, and my chief of staff happens to be Catholic as well, and here are 7 cardinals and a pope. I looked at my chief of staff and said, what are we doing here? So I had a very nice meeting with the Pope, and the meeting begins to break up, and my family's in this adjoining room. So they start to come in, and the Pope and I get up, and the Pope all of a sudden turns to his assistant and says, get me a glass of water. No, really? So I watch his assistant go get a glass of water and brings it back, and Pope takes it in his right hand, puts it in his left hand, and I'm waiting for him to bless it. And he just took a drink. The greatest head fake you have ever seen in your life. I was absolutely convinced that he was going to baptize him right then and there. Having the Pope there was, I guess, I'd have to say it was the most memorable experience of 25 years I was in Congress. I've never seen members of the House or Senate, Democrat, Republican, more excited about having somebody at the Capitol than the Pope. And I got lots of Pope stories. A lot of things happened that day. But unbeknownst to me, the next morning I decided I'm going to retire. You can Google Boehner, Holy Spirit, and you get the rest of that story.
Mr. Speaker, thanks for being here. I'm a little sheepish about this question following that little story, but I'll ask it anyway. You're very gracious in your description of your dealings with the President, and I'm recalling your comment about the budget bill in 2000, the budget deal in 2011 that fell apart. There was a really interesting expose in the New York Times that following spring that really got into the inner workings of the back and forth of that. And putting aside the substance of it, I was fascinated by how the deal fell apart kind of in violation of classic rules of negotiating where you keep your counsel and you kind of keep things to yourself until you're done. You seemed beyond frustrated by that at the time in that expose. Wondering with the benefit of the years that have passed if you can tell us anything more about that. And maybe more importantly, is there a lesson to be learned from that for the people that need to cut the next deal?
Well, frustrated doesn't even begin to describe how I felt about the deal falling apart. I had spent 6 months with the President trying to work through this and trying to work through these numbers. And And my staff came to me about a month, sometime in July of 2014, and my staff sat me down. I thought, what did I do wrong? And they looked at me and said, listen, you're about to risk your job if you continue having this conversation with the president. I said, listen, if I can get this deal done and begin the process of getting America back on a more sound financial foundation, so be it. But Bob Woodward, the former Washington Post writer, writes a lot of books. And he writes a lot of Washington books. And he wrote a book about this that's 98% correct in my view. And so all the facts are there. But, you know, if my world, if you shake hands and cut a deal, it's a deal. You may have regretted it later, but, you know, you shake hands on a deal, it's a deal. And I have to tell you, I was just floored when the president decided to walk away from it. And, you know, let's put it this way. I don't think the president was well served by his own staff. I'll just say it that way.
Welcome to Cleveland. Is there something that Hillary Clinton could have done that would have changed the outcome of the election?
I don't think so. You know, you look at Donald Trump ran against 16 people in a Republican primary. And, you know, 12 or 13 of them are really good opponents. I won't talk about the others. But, you know, he ran away with it. And Donald Trump had a better understanding of what was going through the minds of the American people than a majority of the American people, than anybody else in a Democrat or Republican primary. You know, Bernie created a movement, for God's sakes, all right? And he was frankly closer to where Trump was in terms of understanding the frustration that people were feeling, I think more so than Hillary was.
You ended by talking about how great America is. Yet we have a president-elect who largely got elected by talking about how great America isn't anymore, and promising a lot of things that may or may not be able to be done. So how accountable is he going to be, and who, whether it's Congress or the media or voters, who is going to hold him accountable?
Well, this is Donald Trump. He said a lot of things in the campaign. And the next day he said the exact opposite. The president-elect is going to be the president-elect. And, you know, the media will probably point out these things when he changes his mind about immigration or a few other things, which I would expect. But his voters don't really care. That's the amazing part. They don't really care. So when it comes to this Trump administration, I would just urge all of you to do this. Don't listen to all the noise. Don't pay attention to all that. Just watch what gets done. You know, I used to tell people all the time, you see a politician with their lips moving, you know they're probably not telling you the right thing. All right? So I always tell audiences, don't listen to what they say, just watch what they do. Because it's what they do that really matters. And I'm going to tell you right now, Donald Trump is going to surprise you and a lot of other Americans. Listen, this guy was never involved in politics. But it doesn't take long to be in politics to realize it's really not comfortable to have people upset with you or angry at you or afraid of you. And so my guess is that Trump will move quickly to calm people's nerves. I will predict this right now. He'll be the immigrant's best friend. Just watch.
Okay.
Can we get to the next question, please? Before I stand up here and carry on and get myself in more trouble.
Okay. Some of us will be first-time voters going to college. By the next election, how would the Congress make college affordable?
Well, Congress can't make college more affordable because they don't control the prices that universities charge. This problem is so far out of control, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Right now, there's $1.2 trillion worth of student loan debt. Over the next year, I saw a report this morning from the Government Accountability Office, is that we're about to lose $208 billion of that that's going to be written off because it can't be repaid. And so something has to happen to deal with the student loan debt that's already out there. To think that we're going to allow it to get bigger is probably not going to happen. I think colleges and universities have a responsibility here in terms of what they charge, in terms of how they're running their organizations. And what you are going to see longer term, you're going to see more online schools that frankly do a very good job without all the brick and mortar and all the expense. But you're seeing more and more of it going on around the university systems already. I think you're going to see, frankly, a lot more of it. But I don't know there's a whole lot that the Congress can do to make college more affordable. I know politicians will say that. I'm just telling you the truth.
Speaker Boehner, I appreciated your remarks today. They were really insightful. But the question I have is, we have in this election, the minor political parties received record numbers of votes, and is that more a reflection on the candidates from the major parties, or is that a change that we'll see going forward as essentially the Democrats and Republicans offer each one set of views on all the issues, whereas these minor parties offer a different set of views?
No, I think the third-party candidates that ran, they mostly get protest votes. And if you look back over the summer when people were a little upset with both candidates, their numbers were pretty high. And as the fall went on, their numbers continued to dwindle to Election Day, where they didn't get much of the vote at all. We're fortunate in the United States, in my view, to have essentially a two-party system. And, you look around Europe where they've got 5, 10, sometimes 12 political parties. Not one political party could ever get a majority. And so they've got to compromise who they are to form a government with some other parties. And by the time they come to an agreement with 2 or 3 other parties to form a government, they believe in nothing. And they do nothing. And so we're fortunate that we essentially have a two-party system. Now, within those two parties, I can go through all the divisions in the Democrat Party and all the divisions in the Republican Party that we all get lumped in there. But it works better here than, frankly, it works anywhere else. But I don't see any decline in the two-party system as long as it's open and transparent. They start to play a lot of games. You could have the rise of a third party, but not anytime soon.
Hello.
Hello. I like your haircut.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I like yours too.
Thank you.
Did it come? Was it a lot of pressure that came with your job as Speaker of the House?
No, I gave up the stress and pressure about 20 years ago. I looked up one day, I realized all that pressure, stress does nothing for you except kill you. Doesn't help you make better decisions. And so, no, I just decided I wasn't going to do it anymore, and I flipped the switch, and I didn't. There was more pressure standing up here today giving a speech than I've had in the last 5 years, all right? Because I haven't done a lot of these for a while. But no, I just, it's not good. And it gets in the way of making a good decision. Now, I used to watch some of my colleagues in the leadership and some of my staff run around like chickens with their head cut off when things were falling apart. But it was easier for me to kind of sit there and say a prayer and not worry about it.
Hello. Can you speak to the rise of the alt-right within the Republican Party and what you see for the future there, and also your assessment of the cabinet that President-elect Trump is putting together?
I'm not sure who you're really referring to when you say the alt-right.
well, what I guess the media is terming the alt-right, the white supremacist
Those
contingent.
people. Well, I'm not sure they're part of our party. They may have voted in this election like a lot of people. But I thought you were talking about some of those knuckleheads I used to work with. I better stop myself right there. The second question was about, the cabinet. You know, so far, I think the president-elect, they've made some good choices. And I expect that they'll continue to make some good choices. This is not going to be anything like we've ever seen before. All right? We haven't seen anything like this election in our lifetimes, and we're not going to see anything this coming year like we've seen before. But if you've watched, you've seen Trump stick more to the teleprompter so that he's less like himself. And, the choices he's making are, there's a pattern, there's some reason why these people are being selected. But it's not going to be milquetoast. I mean, picking people who think that can carry out the kind of administration he wants to have. Remember, he's going to do big things, in my view, or attempt to.
I'm a little bit. Mr. Boehner, as a retired politician, if there's one thing you could do over in your political career, what would it be?
Wow. You know, I can tell you I have not one regret. I decided early in my political career, I was a township trustee, and we had some tough vote. And I thought, 20 years from now, nobody's going to ever care how I voted other than me. And so I made a commitment to myself that I never violated my entire 35 years in public office. And that is that at the end of the day, I was going to vote in such a way that I believed was right for my constituents or right for my country or both. Now, they're not one vote my entire political career I'd ever do over. There are probably 5 or 10 votes over all those years. I could have been this way or this way. But I finally made a decision. And literally, after all those votes, 5 or 10 was the maximum number I ever had any problem of gray on. But I made that decision, and I got to tell you, looking back, it's one of the best decisions I ever made. Because I'm the one who had to live with the vote that I cast. And I wanted to be able to look myself in the mirror in the morning and say, you did what you thought was right. Not what you thought was politically correct or would help you get more votes. And then frankly, there isn't enough of that today in terms of just doing the right things for the right reasons. It's not rocket science.
How you doing, Speaker Boehner?
Good.
I'm
doing real good because this is almost over.
So the 113th and the 114th Congresses are probably some of the most polarized, Congresses that I can remember. And what did you do personally to combat that and try to work with people? And then what can the new Congress do to combat the cultural and political polarization that's affecting the country?
Well, things were polarized. We had a president who believed in X, and I and some other Republicans that believed in Y, and so finding common ground was not easy. Secondly, when I did try to find common ground, a lot of people just didn't want me to cut any deal with the president, and any deal I cut with the president was bad. It was bizarre, but that's what people thought, and he was under the same heat from the left. And so one of the great things about this election is that that's all gone away. I mean, we got a Donald Trump. Tim Ryan, Democrat senator from Youngstown, Donald Trump won his district. So here's Tim Ryan go, I'm a Democrat, and I want to do X, but, I got all these Trump people in my district. And then you've got some of these right-wing Republicans, I'm being kind here, who they don't want to do anything because unless it's perfect, whatever perfect is, they're not for it. All of a sudden they're looking up, they got a bunch of these Trump people, a majority in their districts. So if Donald Trump's for it, they're going to have a hard time being against it. And so, and we don't have a president that has any ideology, left wing, right wing. There is none. And so, well, I tell you, get ready for a ride. It's going to be a ride. And all the rules that we've seen, ground rules that Sweeney and I lived with for many years, they're all gone. So get ready. Put your seatbelt on. It's going to be a wild ride.
And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Mr. Boehner. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.